Good morning. I thought today I'd talk a little bit about the path or trajectory of my meditation practice in more down to earth, more technical terms, what I actually did and where I got the information to some extent for what I did. And and the reason for that is you could talk about this sort of sideways, or you can talk about exactly what you accomplished or did on each step or stage along the way. So I'm going to begin at what I consider the beginning. So first of all, uh, I began the idea. I didn't begin the idea of meditating because I had been talking about or thinking about meditating, uh, like I said last time I talked, ever since my undergraduate days at Michigan State, and hadn't been able to get anywhere with that. So uh, I really started the whole idea of meditating or actually doing meditating. And now some people would say, oh, that what I'm talking about isn't really meditating. But, if it gets you from point A to point B, then it's of use, however you decide to describe it. So I was working in a residential treatment center, and I was assigned to work with the opiate group, the opiate treatment group. And they were brand new. Nobody had been treating opiate addiction, at least not where I was working. And there was very little information on how to do what had to be done. And since I was kind of a researcher type, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to help these detoxing heroin addicts, get calm, get a little bit peaceful, be able to, sleep for a minute. Detoxing from heroin is a fairly awful experience. If your brain is a little bit overworked normally and you are withdrawing from heroin, your brain becomes hyper overworked. And insomnia is very common. People sometimes talk about not having any substantial sleep for as long as a week. So anyway, I was responsible for working with this group, and so I began to try and figure out ways to help them treat their insomnia, treat their overworked brains, and help them get through detox. Because if they could get through detox, then they would stay in residential treatment. But if they couldn't, they would abort treatment and leave. So my job was to help them get through detox first and foremost. Uh, and one of the things I discovered was what I'm going to call meditation music. It's very common today. You run into it in lots of. You can, if you have Alexa, just say, play yoga music, Alexa, and you'll get a whole bunch of meditation music. Lots of places to get it. And so what I would do is I'd play this meditation music, and the goal was these people were very restless. It was very hard for them to sit still for any length of time. Uh, they couldn't endure the normal residential treatment kinds of activities because they just couldn't sit in a seat for more than a few minutes without having to wiggle around or stand up or walk. Or so my goal was just to help them sustain, a period of time where they were able to overcome their restlessness. And so I played this meditation music for them. The next thing that I discovered, as I've talked about in previous talks, I was kind of a book Buddhist, book yogi, not really much of a practitioner, but I'd read a lot about the various different things. And I started to run into guided meditation. And so at first I tried playing some guided meditations, but that didn't quite seem to fit the bill for these detoxing heroin addicts. So instead, I started to work out my own guided meditations, and I became quite good at it. Sometimes I think that what you're really talking about is group hypnosis, but I learned to create a guided meditation that allowed these restless detoxing heroin addicts to not only stay still for a period of time, but sometimes to actually fall asleep for short periods of time. Now, that may seem like, whoa, you're trying to help people fall asleep in treatment, but every little bit of sleep they could get helped them sustain the rigors of detox, and made it possible for them to stay in treatment long enough to really get some benefit from it. So guided meditations. In the in the meantime, I began to listen it for myself, for my own purposes at home, to both meditation music and guided meditations. I had my own problem with restlessness, as do I think a lot of people who start a meditation practice. You could think of the brain as either underworking or overworking. If you have a brain that's overworking, sitting and sustaining stillness and silence for a period of time is not very easy, because your brain is just working away while you're sitting there trying to be still. Uh, if you're lucky enough to have a brain that's underworking, you know, you're going to find meditation to be a little bit easier. I was probably someplace in the middle of that. I mean, my brain wasn't particularly overworked or underworked. I was probably someplace in the median, and most people are a couple of standard deviations from the median, the vast majority of people. So most people probably have a lot in common with my experience. So first I'd listen to this meditation music, and I got myself so I could sit still, not doing anything particular, not focusing on anything, or just sitting still for 15 to 20 minutes. And I started out maybe 5, 10 minutes was a push, and eventually I got someplace between 20 and 30 minutes able to sit still. So that was kind of like what I consider working a base for the next steps. So, and on top of that, I also listened to some guided meditations. And some of the guided meditations, they came from the mindfulness movement, I think, particularly Jon Kabat-Zinn, and for a book to kind of look at that I think is pretty practical, Catastrophic Living by Jon Kabat-Zinn. So anyway, I started, using some of the techniques I found in the mindfulness movement, and so the first thing I decided to do was, now that I could sit still for a short period of time, it seemed to me that because while I'm sitting still, my brain is still very active. Talking to myself in my head. I'm, thinking about things, planning, and to me that it was an accomplishment to be able to sit still. But the next step would be able to slow my overworking mind down as much as I possibly could. And the best way I could think of to do that was to develop concentration. So the first kinds of technique I, discovered. By the way, I didn't invent anything. I discovered things by either reading or listening or paying attention to other people's, stories about how they meditated. So the first thing I started to do was to focus on an object. And in my case, the object I chose to focus on was my own breath. And in order to focus on my breath, I began to do what's called counting the breath. So counting the breath is simply you breathe in, you breathe out, and then you count your out breath. You breathe in, and then you breathe out, and you count your out breath. So 1, 2, and you keep counting the out breath until you get to 10. When you get to 10, you just start over at 1. And this way you're keeping your focus on the out breath and the counting of the out breath. Now, you think when you hear that and you've never tried it, you think, oh, geez, that sounds easy. And it probably wouldn't be too hard if you were lucky enough to have an underworking brain or a less active brain system. If you're probably someplace in that middle ground like me, it's not that easy to stay focused on anything for any length of time. And what you find is your mind starts to wander, and before you know it, you've lost count. In which case, if you lose count, you just bring your attention back to the first count, one, and start all over again. And you're going to lose count if you're, pretty much in that sort of average group. You're going to lose count over and over and over again. And then when you realize you've lost count, you're going to bring your attention back to one, starting all over again. Now, some people might think, oh, geez, I lose count so much. I'm a failure. There's something wrong with me. I can't do this. Well, the losing count is actually a really important part of growth, because every time you lose count and bring your attention back to the beginning, you're actually strengthening, I'm going to call it a muscle. You're actually strengthening a mind muscle that makes your capacity for concentration grow and become a little bit better. So I started that practice of counting the breath, and I did it for over a year. I didn't use any other techniques, and that's something I really thought a lot about over time. Don't mix techniques too much. Pick a technique and stick to it until you become accomplished at it. So eventually I became accomplished at counting the breath and sustaining the count and not having to go back to one over and over again. In other words, I stayed focused on counting the breath. So the next step was to stop counting the breath, but keep your focus on the breath. So in a sense, you begin to breathe in and then breathe out, and just take note of the fact that you are breathing out. Breathe in and then breathe out, and then just take note of the fact that you're breathing out. Just like with the count, when you lose track, you realize that you veered off, that you've drifted into some thought waves or something. Just bringing your attention back to the breath and following the breath. Now, if it becomes particularly difficult and you find that it's just not working, then returning to counting the breath for a short period, and then starting the following the breath technique, where you're just paying attention to the breath. Eventually, I don't know how long I did that, probably a couple of years, I don't know, staying focused on the breath. During this, this time, using these, what I'm going to refer to as meditation exercises, I developed the ability to stay concentrated for, periods of time, longer periods of time. I would sometimes lose focus, and then I would realize I lost focus, and I bring my attention back to the breath, and then stay focused on the breath for a period of time. But the periods of time that I stayed focused on the breath became longer and longer until I could sustain my focus on the breath for 30, 40, 45 minutes. I did that for a considerable period of time until I developed, or really became, I developed that skill. The next step, based on some of the things I read in the mindfulness movement, the techniques talked about by Jon Kabat-Zinn and some of the other mindfulness movement meditation masters, I decided to move to the next stage. So the next stage is basically using the concentration that you've developed and maintaining the breath as an anchor. You begin to become observant of what's occurring in the present moment. So the first step in that was I would be sitting, I would be following the breath, a thought would occur, I would take note of the thought and just say quietly in my mind, thought, and then return my attention back to the breath. A sound would occur. I would take note of the sound, and then I would simply say quietly in my mind, sound. I could get even more specific. For instance, I would hear birds singing out the window and just take note of the fact that there were birds sitting out the window and say quietly in my mind, bird song. I did that for a considerable period of time. And the goal here, if there is a goal, is to become able to stay focused on the moment that you're presently in and not let your mind drift into the past or into the future, but staying present centered. The next step in the process was to do what I did with counting the breath, moving to following the breath, only do that with this present centered focusing. So instead of saying quietly in my mind thought or sound or the bird song, I would simply notice it and then return to the breath. So I would hear a sound, I would notice the sound, and return my attention to breathing. So all along, I'm using the breath as an anchor. The breath is there always as a sort of place to, to return to. If I found that my thoughts were just flying off the table or whatever, then I would just return to following the breath. And then once I settled, I would start to focus on the present moment. So I did that for a considerable period of time, focusing on the present moment. One of the things that occurred then was I would find myself longer and longer sustaining the spaces between, having to, bring my attention back to the present, to the, so basically what happened is I would begin to have long periods where my mind was focused on what you could call emptiness or just present centered focus with no object in mind. So you could say that what was happening was I was focusing on a space where a thought or a sound could occur, but was not currently occurring. And I would stay focused on that for long periods of time, eventually reaching a point where thoughts and sounds became less intrusive, occurred less frequently, and sometimes being able to sustain periods as long as a half hour without having a thought or making note of a sound or things like that. It isn't that I wasn't hearing sounds or that thoughts weren't, attempting to intrude. It's that I simply stayed focused on the present moment without allowing intrusion or any of those kinds of things to break up my focus on that present centered moment, that mindful moment. I did that I still do that. That's still part of my practice on a daily basis. Notice how each step along the way builds to the next step and to the next step. Eventually, I reached a point where I started to realize that I needed to understand or answer some questions. The first question is, what is this mind? What is this I, me, mine, me, object, the sense of self that I experience? What's real and what's not real? I started to ask questions as a part of my meditation. Who am I and what am I and what is this mind and things like that. So that led to the next stage in my meditation practice, and I've heard it termed or a term used to describe it as introspective analysis. I believe that's the term that the Dalai Lama uses, although I've never heard him discuss what it means, although I'm sure he probably has. So introspective analysis. Basically, introspective analysis started with me attempting to figure out what was going on in my mind. How did my mind work? How did the things that were happening in my mind occur? Where did they begin and where were they going? And introspective analysis is still my primary practice. I still follow the breath. I still pay attention to the empty spaces. Focus on the space where an object can occur but isn't currently occurring. I still do all those things, but in the process, I allow my mind to explore itself. And in doing that, what I've basically concluded is a sequence of events that seems to be how my mind works. Uh, so, just a short form of that is I experience a thought or sensation. The sensation or thought is objectified, turned into an object. The object is then reacted to. I have some sort of a immediate, instantaneous reaction, liking or disliking or neutral. The next step is perception. I categorize the thought or sense object and give it a name, give it a label, and a form, a descriptive image. I then, enter into cognition where I start to tell a story about the perceived object. The story then leads to some sort of intention. The intention leads to an action, and the action is then stored in memory for future reference, making it more likely that the process will reoccur in exactly the same manner that it occurred the last time. Uh, by the way, this whole description of watching my mind and how it works fits pretty well with psychology, modern psychology, as well as fitting well with some of the ideas in Buddhist philosophy. Uh, so that's my meditation practice today, introspective analysis, but it's based on the ability to follow the breath, to sustain mindful moments, to stay focused for long periods of time, to use the ability to stay concentrated, to watch the mind in its operations, and to pay attention to how those operations unfold. And okay, so how does that affect me? Well, the major effect is to realize, and I'll talk more about this at some future time, is to realize that everything that I experience, everything that I know, is mind created, is a construct of mentation. And as a result of that, I've discovered something that's very useful in my everyday life. Since my mind is making my experience, if I change my mind, if I change the way the process unfolds, then I'm able to experience a different reality than the reality that I might have experienced if my mind was left to do things on its own accord. So I'll stop there with today's talk. Mostly, I wanted to just stay in the arena of practicality and give some description or blueprint. Make sure you understand that each of us is different. You're not like me, and I'm not like you in some respects. For instance, in the respect of having a very active brain or an underactive brain, we're all a little bit different in that regard. So the blueprint I'm describing, the meditation trajectory, is the one that I used. I don't believe to some extent it's not uncommonly used. I believe that, I have validation because the description I'm giving is very similar to this description I've read about and heard about from other people who have practiced meditation. So, but each of us has to find their own individual path. Uh, a, a simple example of that is, how do you sit? That's the first question. Even before, I began to listen to that meditation music. How do you stay? How do you be in that physical moment? What's your sitting style, you might say? I started out laying down on my back because that was the most comfortable way to be, listening to meditation music and guided meditations. Some people would have a very hard time with that because they would fall asleep. And luckily for me, or I don't know if it's lucky or not, it just wasn't something that was a problem for me. I didn't fall asleep. Uh, but it didn't feel right. It never really felt right. I realized that if you're going to use your breath as a focus, your breath has to be free to flow. And so, in order for your breath to be free to flow, you had to be sitting heart open, shoulders a little bit back, and elongated spine so that the breath can move from your belly to your lungs and back out of your nostrils, freely and easily and loosely. I tried lots of different sitting methods. Now, I didn't start actually sitting until someplace in my 50s, early 50s. And so, first method I tried was the one that was insisted upon, particularly by Zen devotees. The only way you can sit in meditation is to sit cross-legged on a zafu, which is just a little cushion or pillow that allows you to have your hips slightly above your knees, so that when you cross your legs, now crossing your legs could mean full lotus, not easy to do for Americans, Westerners, or half lotus, still not that easy to do, and easy pose, which is just loosely crossing your legs in front of you. Even that's pretty difficult for Westerners. People from Eastern cultures have spent a good deal of their life sitting on floors, cross-legged, kneeling, taking meals that way, sitting in groups that way. It's a much more common practice, and chairs are used, or at least were used historically, a lot less in Eastern cultures. In Western cultures, we're used to sitting in chairs, so when we sit cross-legged, it causes a lot of pain. Now, if you listen to some Zen masters, they would tell you that pain is something that you should endure and work through, and that it's a part of gaining mastery in meditation. For me, if I would have experienced a tremendous amount of pain when I first started meditating, I probably wouldn't have come back to meditation. I probably would have given up. Maybe that's a weakness on my part. I'm not. I'm pretty sure that I'm going to find an awful lot of people who feel the same way. So I experimented, and remember I talked about in previous sessions that I saw meditation as a research project. So I experimented with lots of different ways of sitting. Uh, Laying down didn't seem right, so I tried the cross-legged technique. I tried cross-legged with my back against a wall. My big problem there was I had immediate, extreme, and intense back pain because I have a slight case of scoliosis. I was kind of old with arthritis. I also found that sitting cross-legged, even in half lotus, caused me to have knee pain and hip pain. So the end result was sitting in a standard cross-legged pose was a very unpleasant experience for me. And so I decided to try some other things. There was another approach, which is sitting in hero pose. By this time, I had encountered at least, vaguely some yoga poses. And so a hero pose is just simply sitting on your heels or between your feet in a kneeling pose. Uh, that that it worked for a while. Eventually, I started putting a cushion or a pillow between my seat and my feet to sort of cushion the pressure, and I was able to sit for some period of time that way. But eventually, I got tendonitis in the ankles and the tops of my feet, which produced a lot of pain, even pain when I got up for meditation, made it painful to walk. So I started looking for a way to, solve that problem, and I discovered a Seiza bench. This is a Seiza bench. A Seiza bench allows you to place a bench underneath your seat with your legs underneath the bench, which allows you to rest your weight on the bench as opposed to on your heels or your on a cushion or whatever, which results in less pain. Now, it wasn't a totally pain-free way of sitting. At first, it took a while for my knees to get used to sitting in a kneeling pose, but eventually I got so I could sit in a kneeling pose with or without the bench for sustained periods of time. I could teach a 3-hour workshop sitting on my Seiza bench without any difficulty at all. I could sustain hour-long meditation practices. I could do that while sitting up straight, allowing the breath to flow freely. And so that became my go-to method of sitting, sitting Seiza, as they say. Uh, so, you know, we're all different. Some people, I have a yoga teacher that I studied under for some period of time, who could sit in, a cross-legged, full lotus pose, pretty much without any difficulty at all. She didn't even need a cushion under her seat to raise her hips up above her knees. She was perfectly comfortable with that, and apparently was perfectly comfortable from that practically from day one. That's just the way she was made. We're all made different, and so our practices are likely to look different from person to person. And we should, I think the diversity of meditation pathways is really actually a good thing. And when we share our particular blueprint or way that we use to meditate with other people, there's always going to be some people who gravitate or see the way that you're talking about as being something that would be helpful to them. So uh, I'm going to leave you there today. I hope that you'll find this practical offering as useful. I'm going to end today, since this is election day, I'm to end today with my prayer that I end all my meditation and yoga practices with. May all beings be peaceful. May all beings be happy. May all beings be safe. May all beings discover their true nature. And may all beings be free. Thank you for listening to me today. Namaste.